Before we end, I'd like to quickly touch on Syria.
Yeah.
There's been some massive changes recently. Within 12 days, the Assad regime completely fell apart. And you've been vocally skeptical about the developments in Syria, about it being positive. Could you quickly kind of summarize what your main kind of skepticisms come from?
Well, I'm not skeptical about it being positive in the sense that Assad was a brutal dictator who oppressed his people, ran a police state effectively from 2000 when he took over from his dad, who had ruled from 1970. But it's the same as Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He was also a brutal dictator, and in the invasion in 2003, if you started saying you were against the invasion or whatever, that the argument against you would be, oh well, you just think Saddam's great. And it's like, no. So when I was while I'm skeptical about what happened in Syria, doesn't mean that I am a supporter of Assad or what he was, because I've got nothing good to say about him or the state he ran. But HTS, who are now basically the de facto leaders of Syria, and are Al-Qaeda, right? They say they're not, but if you look at even the UK government website said they rebranded as Al-Qaeda, but they should be thought of as the same thing. That's the UK government website. Jilani, his history, he was in Iraq after the invasion and worked with Zarqawi in Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and their whole operation in Iraq was to start a sectarian war, which they eventually did. 2006 and 2007, they bombed Al-Maskari Mosque in Samara, and Zarqawi is known about. I mean, he was killed by the Americans eventually, and Jilani was put in prison by the Americans in 2006. But he might have changed. Well, he says he's changed. People say he's changed. But my point is, of course, if someone like that takes power, you should be skeptical, because, I mean, essentially for his crimes that he's done previously, he should be on trial. So, I mean, and also the other point is how it happened, you know. There was a genuine uprising in 2011, yeah, and I had friends that were involved in that. But when it was put down violently by Assad, the imperial powers instantly got involved. And this is all a matter of record. In 2012, the CIA started Operation Timber Sycamore, which was like one of the biggest covert operations of the CIA in its history, which over $1 billion a year funding armed groups who were fighting Assad. The Israelis in the subsequent period were supporting the rebels, and it treated over 1,000 of their fighters in Israel.
And it's, I think, important also to mention that the rebels are not one.
No, of course not. But we don't quite know what. Well, they said moderate rebels. That was the famous phrase of the United States. But yeah, we don't. But my point was, it's clear that the empire wanted Assad out. Regardless of what you think about Assad, it's not. And why did they want Assad out? It wasn't because he was a dictator, because we support dictators all over the Middle East. The point was, he wasn't our dictator, much like Saddam Hussein. Although Saddam Hussein was our dictator up to when he invaded Kuwait, or he was at least had a good relationship. But they wanted him out, and another part of it was the Israelis wanted him out because he wasn't. He was part of the axis of resistance. Now, people have said subsequently why he didn't believe in it, there was no Syrian attacks on Israel. Fine, that's all true. And his reasoning might have been, we don't know because we were not inside his head. But the point was, the facts on the ground was, it was a major supply line to Hezbollah. Like all the weapons got from Iran, Iraq to South Lebanon via Syria. And Israel obviously wanted to break up the axis of resistance. And in fact, there was, I found when all this happened, like some emails that Hillary Clinton had received while she was at the State Department, because there was a FOIA request for her emails, and they were all released at one point, or some of them were released. And there was one briefing on Syria, on Israel and Syria, and basically they were saying the best way we can protect Israel's security is to support an uprising against Assad. Again, this is nothing to say. This doesn't take agency away from Syrians. It's perfectly reasonable for Syrians to want to overthrow Assad. I'm not saying that, but you can also understand that and understand the role that Syria plays geopolitically, and the role that and the reason it's the enemy of the United States. It is similar to the discourse around Saddam Hussein. Like, it's easy. You can understand why it's not a good thing for the United States to invade Iraq or attack Iraq, and that doesn't make you supportive of Assad. So, I was elated to see the Sednaya and places like that get emptied. I had a friend that was in Sednaya. I know all about the brutality of the Assad regime, but if you look at a history of Western-backed overthrows of dictators, Gaddafi, Saddam, like is there an example that's a good of a good ending?
Is this actually a Western-backed overthrow of Bashar al-Assad? Like you mentioned about how, there were memos about how they should support some sort of moderate uprising and the such. But I mean, whilst Julani or Ahmed al-Shar has had his bounty removed, sanctions still remain on Syria.
Yeah.
So I mean, if it's their guy, then why are there still sanctions there?
Well, effectively, people accept this. They're proxies of the Turkey, right? Of like HTS. I mean, the Syrian National Army.
The SNA.
They're explicit. Like, everyone knows them. But HTS, everyone said it's less direct. But they're saying they're basically working with Erdogan, and that Erdogan gave the okay for the operation that led to Assad's toppling. So Turkey is a major member of NATO. It's got NATO's second largest land army, Incirlik base in southern Turkey, is not far from the Syrian border. There's like 5,000 American troops there. So yes, I think that it's safe to say, if you include Turkey as the West, or at least as NATO, they approve of it. Whether the United States was involved, but then also look at the timetable of when it happened. It happened the day after a ceasefire was announced in Lebanon, and then Jelani was and other HTS officials have been saying, well, our problem is not with Israel, our problem is with Iran. Like I haven't been exposed to this sectarianism before, but I'm not saying it works one way or the other, but it's clear that Syria, there's a sectarian element to that has been exposed, and it was quite shocking to see Jelani say, or not, it wasn't him, sorry, it was it was the appointed mayor,
governor of Damascus.
Yeah, governor of Damascus,
who then came out and denied that he said it after.
But I saw him say it on.
But he's. I mean, there's talk about. Most people agree that he did say it, but after he got called out for it, he came out and he denied that he said it.
But other officials have said things like, we don't want to, we're not at war with Israel, blah blah blah. At the same time as Israel's like occupied huge parts of the territory and literally wiped out all. So you are at war with them. And then other people will say, well, it's not the time now. But then look at Yemen. Yemen was destroyed by Saudi, UAE, Britain, and America from 2015 to 2022. Literally, some of the worst crimes of the modern period. A man-made famine, millions of kids on the brink of starvation, and they've just come out of that, and they're fighting. They're sending rockets to Israel. So I don't think that this is like they're talking nice and then they're gonna actually turn on Israel. I don't think so. I think that they're going to get subsumed into the system, because that is the goal of the US, Britain, and that's how they're going to be able to operate. Unfortunately, that's how the system works. It's a straitjacket. They're not going to go in and be like, well, they're not going to allow any kind of anti-Israel or anti-Zionist regime or government on the border of Israel. Now they've replaced one who was part of the Axis of Resistance, and they will say, like, I think it was Jelani even said, he said Syria will no longer be a staging post for any attacks on Israel. So they're saying it explicitly. Again, like,
I mean, there has been, what would you say, some concerning statements, but the Syrian context is not the Yemeni context. And in terms of the Israelis or the Americans not allowing for an anti-Israel government to exist, I mean, whilst they helped create chaos in Syria, I mean, they didn't really push for the ending of Assad. I mean, they could have done what they did in Libya, right? Which is, no-fly zones, NATO-style bombings, etc. But they didn't do that in Syria. Instead, they armed the rebels enough to create chaos, but didn't arm them enough to take them down. And in terms of the supposed threat to Israel that Assad may have had or may have posed, and we saw not almost immediately, but within weeks of HTS taking control, that the Israelis bombed weapons and military assets that were under Assad's control for decades. And they hadn't touched them before. So I mean, the question is, in that case, I mean, if the Israelis and the Americans are so sure that this current government are not going to pose a threat, and Assad did pose a threat, then why have all these military sites been attacked now when they were there for the taking before?
It's a good question. I mean, I would just say that they're just cut. It's an insurance mechanism, isn't it? They've literally now got a demilitarized country. The Syria's whole military has been wiped out. Whatever happens in Syria after HTS, with HTS, it doesn't matter, because they have been completely their ability to resist Israel or to defend themselves from Israel has gone. So, I mean, that's the same with the occupation. It's like, what can they get away with? With Assad, they couldn't have done that when Assad was in power. Now they can. So I don't think that's a signal that they're scared of HTS.
Why couldn't they have done that when Assad was in power? I mean, they bombed Damascus relentlessly.
Yeah, but they couldn't. I suppose they could have, but I don't think that's a sign. I don't think that's a sign that they see HTS as more of a danger than Assad. I think it's just that was an opportunity, or or it's an unknown factor. But the point is, if you look at the statements of HTS, if you look at the how the Western media has reacted, it's flipped. It's like if for HTS and the new government were really going to be a threat, do you think that you'd get articles in the Daily Telegraph saying like Jelani's diversity friendly? They don't back people like that unless they are sure that they're going to be doing the West bidding.
I mean, if we take a look at the way that the West treated Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, for example. Yeah. I mean, Sisi's their guy, Mubarak was their guy, but I mean, the revolution in Egypt created facts on the ground that they just had to deal with. Is that
they didn't really? They didn't. Yeah, they didn't. They didn't. What's it called? They didn't promote Morsi though in the media. I don't think in the same way. They didn't promote him as this great figure like they're doing with Jelani. The point is also like Mohammed, like HTS is a prescribed organisation in the UK. So this is a group that the UK government says is no different, is a rebrand of Al Qaeda. That's not me saying that. That's what the government's saying.
I mean, Al Qaeda would disagree. They don't particularly, they're not particularly fond of what Giuliani is doing.
No,
and his,
but I mean, it's all about him, isn't it? Really, because but his lineage, you can see where he came from.
Yeah.
That's undeniable. Baghdadi, who became the leader of ISIS, he was then the leader of Al Qaeda in Iraq. Sent him to Syria to set up Al Qaeda in Syria, which became Al Nusra. So.
But he turned against them eventually. Like that was the whole reason for the rebrand.
Yeah, but think about but in that period, what was he doing? There was some more. It's whether he's reformed or something. There has to be some acceptance especially the campaign in Iraq. I mean, he was a younger man then, but like we're talking about like bombing mosques, bombing markets. Like Zarqawi was. Yeah, and then ISIS as well. You know, like I'm not saying that he was in Al Qaeda in Iraq, and Baghdadi he was deputy to Baghdadi, but this was pre-ISIS, but essentially the same organization got a new name. Like, so I mean, come on, that's I'm not look, I can't get behind someone who has that kind of history. I can't because unless there's some acceptance that he comes and says, but the amount of criminal stuff that happened, bombings of civilians, that needs to be dealt with, surely.
I mean, the issue is that no one really has clean hands in Syria. I mean, there was an extremely messy civil war period, and so the question arises. I mean, what happened is you had a bloody civil war, a dictator was toppled, and you're now in a situation where, I mean, the one faction who has had a hand to play in killings and whatnot, they're now in charge, and so the question is, where do we go from here? Like, what kind of position do we have in order to make sure we don't fall back into civil war? I mean, for me, the greatest indicator that, I mean, whilst things are uncertain, we're at least moving in a positive direction, is just the reaction of everyday Syrians. I mean, you said it yourself about how you were extremely happy when Sednaya prison was emptied.
Yeah.
I mean, this is surely a good sign for the Syrian people that, like, one of the first actions that these people took, whether or not, regardless of what they what they have done in the past, was to empty all the prisons. And the Syrian people in general, I mean, we've seen videos coming out, and overwhelmingly, although there are issues, overwhelmingly it seems to be quite a positive mood in Syria.
But then look at Iraq, man. You had that elation, toppling. I'm not. Obviously, it was a foreign intervention, or foreign war, but the who couldn't be touched by them toppling the images of Saddam Hussein emptying those prisons, and then you had the civil war. I don't know. And the other thing is, who else is happy? The Israelis are happy. The Americans are happy. So, and they're not happy.
Are they that happy? I mean,
I think they are, man.
There have been some reports from at least some Israeli media outlets, some conversations about how Syria is now a threat because Turkey could, I mean,
take it over.
Not take it over, but necessarily but it could become part of some new axis.
Yeah.
In which
But Turkey's in bed with Israel. It's bullshit. Nearly all the stuff Erdogan says is lies. Like he's even the stuff I was talking about, the flight tracker. You see all these like this Incirlik base, which I found in a WikiLeaks cable. Erdogan, he became prime minister in 2003, just before the Iraq invasion, and then he promised privately, or his top general promised the Americans privately, Incirlik is yours, you must enjoy it. Even while publicly he was saying he was against the war in Iraq, and Incirlik wouldn't be used as to move troops in and out of Iraq. And then recently, like I've seen loads of flights going from Incirlik to Arafat Qatari and then onto Israel, and I think oil's still going from Turkey. So, and he's part of NATO. Like, the proof's in the pudding. So I just don't. I think that it's naive, or at least I understand it, right? Because everything you're saying is correct. unless you've lost your humanity, you should be touched by seeing people being freed from. But you also, that doesn't mean you can't have to be naive as to how the Western powers operate and how Israel operates. And it might be a nice theory that Israel's really scared, and this is like, because it fits nice with the revolutionary idea, right? That you got these great liberators who have liberated, or the country is liberated of a dictatorship. It would be great if they were also concerned with freeing Palestine, but I just don't think that is the case. From what I've seen, and from what I've seen in previous Western-backed, whether it was definitely backed, Western-backed overthrows of dictators, they don't allow. I don't know if there's any example of a official enemy dictator who was taken out by a Western-backed internal force or external forces. Suddenly, that force has then stood up to the West. There hasn't been one, and integral to that is ensuring Israel's security, and that's. Whether they've taken back what they're saying or whatever, why do they feel they needed to say that? Because, and the other thing is, it is important to stress that they all talk about Iran, right? And crimes were committed on like both sides in Syria for sure. But because of the level of violence that happened there between, it's Hezbollah, Russia, and Assad on one side, and HTS and all the other rebel groups, like that were supported by the Qatar and Saudis. Like that's the frame they see it in. Whether that's right or wrong, understandable, whatever, that is the fact. That's the frame they're seeing it in. So they say our truck is with Iran. It's not with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, the Assad regime was on the verge of falling. And then the Iranians and the Russians,
yeah, of course,
Hezbollah, they came and they saved
it. Yeah.
So, but it is understandable that.
Yeah, but then on the other side, is it not also understandable if you're concerned with freeing Palestine? If you say who are the major forces outside of Palestine who have landed a blow on Israel, right? It's Ansar Allah in Yemen, it's Hezbollah, and it's Iran, not Syria, but Syria was a supply line, whatever. So. What
no, then the question.
But then surely, that's important though, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's important, but I mean then the question raises itself: do the Syrian people then have to forego their own rights?
No, exactly. No. Of course, no. That's the point. Like you shouldn't have to sacrifice. But my point is, if you're just looking at it from a strategic level, I'm not saying whether I'm not putting a value judgment on it. In fact, if I was going to put a value on a falling dictator and emptying of thousands of political prisoners is a good thing, but that doesn't mean you have to be naive to the strategic implications of that, which is that it's a win for Israel. It is, of course, it is. And that's what I'm saying. It would be nice to the story of the revolution that it's not good for Israel, but that's just not.
Yeah, tactically, but strategically, long term, is it?
Well, I mean,
time will tell, right?
Well, I don't know. Well, it could get out of control, I guess. That's the thing. But I think under HTS it's because look at their backers, like the Saudi's going to normalize with
yeah, but is our Saudi really? I mean, really, when you talk about backers, really we're talking about. I mean, like the Turks and maybe the Qataris are like really like the most outspoken backers of.
Yeah, but that's what. But exactly. So, but they're not like. They're not out. They're deeply embedded in the whole network, the Western imperialism, and also don't do anything against Israel. Like there's only the axis of resistance. As Netanyahu said this, he said, what did he say? Along the lines of they've destroyed Hamas, they've decapitated Hezbollah. We've taken out their supply line in Syria. So,
but they haven't destroyed Hamas, and Hezbollah is still an effective fighting force. I mean,
but how effective will they be if they can't? They're isolated now. It's a fact. They are isolated. They got there's no way to get weapons into Lebanon. I mean, it is true what you're saying in that there's what Donald Rumsfeld called unknown unknowns. Of course, when you create a fluid situation like there is in Syria, especially with a group like HTS with that history, you don't know, it could go different ways. But I think that two reasons. One is I think that they see their war more as a sectarian one than as a war for Palestine, and two, there's many mechanisms to get people into line once you've got once you've overthrown a dictator who was an official enemy, and they're doing that. So I doubt those they're going to be used. And also, like, the sectarianism, the imperialism has used sectarianism from fucking. Also, I should have used sectarianism from day. You know, like if you want to control an area, and there's a schism, the best way to do that is to promote that schism.
Yeah.
And then they take your eyes off. And that's. I'm not even, and I don't want to get involved in all this stuff. I wasn't actually even aware of it before the Syria thing, and I've been exposed to it in a very sort of real way. But the fact is, like, that the sectarianism is also good for Israel, of course.
Yeah, but
and I'm just
they
looking
would
at
say that the sectarianism was stoked by Assad, and the and the Iranians and the Russians. That's what their stance would be.
Yeah. But my stance would be, look, I'm just looking from a very, very external viewpoint, which it is. I have no truck in that world. I'm an atheist. I'm not Muslim. I don't even know too much about the schism that Shia and Sunni. But I'm looking at who is landing blows on this genocidal settler colony, and I'm looking at what countries are facilitating, and I'm looked at, and I'm just seeing I'm seeing a network, and I'm evaluating that the empire and its little satellite is going to be happy if that network gets smashed. That doesn't then mean, as you say, like, that doesn't mean that Syrians have to be sacrificed for the freedom of Syrians has to be sacrificed so you can maintain a supply line to Hezbollah. But it also doesn't mean we should be we have to be naive about the realities of what it means for the resistance to the resistance to Israel.
But there are some good signs. I mean, I also mentioned the how Syrians feel, but recently there has been this one individual who was part of HTS. I mean, I think they're trying to disband HTS in some way or another, just make it essentially the state. But he's an Egyptian who went to Syria and he fought with HTS. His name is, I think it's Ahmed Mansour. And he then decided to start up a kind of a revolutionary Egyptian faction. And he started threatening Sisi.
Right.
And HTS or Julani and the security forces, they arrested him. And the Egyptians requested that HTS and Julani send him over. But the good sign is that they didn't. They refused.
Okay.
And they're releasing him.
Okay.
So, I mean, you mentioned that Egypt is another, or Sisi is another stooge of the empire. And if HTS want to be part of that system, they need to play well with the other kids, so to speak. It's understandable, the perspective that okay, this axis of resistance has been smashed, in a way, and the revolution didn't exactly help the axis of resistance, but there are signs. I mean, and also the dubious history of the participants of the revolutions is nothing to ignore either. But there are signs that this could lead to a positive direction.
Yeah, well, look, if you get rid of a dictator, who, as I say, it's unknown unknowns. We don't know. It's out of HTS's control. There's no single element in Syria that controls this. So of course, like there's a chance it can go anyway. But my point is, like, that the empire is not a neutral force and is not so that they'll be pushed in certain ways. Whoever it is, it might not be HTS. They'll be pushed in certain ways, and we have some historical precedents. Look at Gaddafi, right? That was a freaking nightmare, man. In Libya, and all the oil went out to Western companies. I mean, I'm not like, the funny thing is that I did quite a lot of work on Assad's and the UK for Declassified, and he came to the UK in 2001, and I got the briefing notes Tony Blair went to Damascus in 2001 for the first time ever by a UK premier, and I got the briefing notes. And basically, it was like talking about how they basically wanted to bring Assad into the fold, and it was all about Shell. Shell had a huge investment up till the uprising in 2011, when EU sanctions meant they had to withdraw. So it wasn't like he was outside of the sort of corporate imperial system in that sense. But yeah, I don't know. It's basically impossible for anyone to say. There's so many moving parts. You've got the Kurds as well in Rojava. Who knows what's going to happen to that? Turkey. I mean, like the Turks hate the Kurds, or not the Turks. Sorry, the Turkish government has enacted many policies over the years that have really been targeted at destroying the Kurdish independence movement within Turkey and in northern Iraq, Syria. Like the SNA, that was much more, because HTS took Damascus, but SNA also made an offensive at the same time, and their defensive was mainly against the Kurdish autonomous region. And many people say, and I actually agree with this, that now Erdogan is going to use Trump's presidency to basically just obliterate Rojava and make it destroy it effectively, because they don't want that on their border. They don't want this Kurdish autonomous region that's going to inspire Kurdish independence movements in Turkey.
Yeah, the links to the PKK and whatnot.
Yeah, the PKK, but the PKK, well, it's the Syrian Democratic Forces, the PKK within Turkey. You mean? Yeah.
But the SDF is US backed.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I know all it, and they've been siphoning all the oil out of the US. But what I mean is that's another move. I mention them because that's another moving part. We don't know what's going to happen. There's so many moving parts.
Yeah.
And obviously, it is true what you're saying. In that context, when you got that many moving parts, no one's in full control. So it can go either way. But it's very rare that you can have a revolution that survives and is independent of the imperial powers. Like the one I know about more than most is Cuba in 1959, and that's kind of what I think about when I think of a revolution, because Castro came in and instantly nationalized everything, kicked out every US company. Like the US basically invaded 2 years later a Bay of Pigs. That's not what we're seeing. We're not seeing we're seeing Jelani welcome all these Western dignitaries. We're seeing, whether they believe it or not, you might say they don't believe it, but we're seeing verbal promises that Israel will be untouched, that the Axis, Syria's role as a part of the Axis resistance is finished. That's a whole different ballgame. Like, whether there's elements within HTS that push them in a different, I don't know, but because again, there's movement within HTS. I imagine. I don't know too much about it, but yeah, I just what's that Gramsci phrase? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I guess that's what you feel like. There's, as you say, it's optimistic for Syrians that they got rid of a dictator, but having a look at history and having a look at the central role that Syria plays in the chessboard, freedom and sovereignty is not what external powers want them to have, and it's quite hard to resist that. That's my take. Again, I would finish on this though. I think that it would be a disaster if it rips apart the pro-Palestine movement, because there's been unity across, like, not just within the Muslim community, but across all communities on stopping Israel's genocide in Gaza. And Syria has shaken a lot of that, like, unity.
Yeah.
And split people apart. And I think that's, again, is a Zionist, that's a dream for the Zionists, because, I mean,
Syria's kind of been a tricky point for the pro-Palestine movement over the last 13 years. But I, for one, I'm pretty optimistic that the Syrians will be capable of maneuvering, even though it's difficult. I mean, the miracle of Gaza, of Israel completely failing in Gaza. I mean, against the most high-tech army in the world, backed by the greatest empire the world has ever seen. I mean, if we can witness that,
Yeah.
and witness the Palestinians survive this genocide, I can only be hopeful. I can only be optimistic. That things will happen.